There is a bird in your yard right now that you have probably seen hundreds of times, maybe thousands. You recognize it the way you recognize a neighbor, not by name, not by history, just by presence. The red flash at the feeder, the small shape on the same branch, the familiar song before you've had your coffee. What most people don't know is that there's a good chance it's the same bird, not the same species, the same individual. And it has been coming back to your yard for longer than you think. Welcome to Backyard Bird Mind. Every week we go deeper into what's actually happening between you and the birds in your yard. Subscribe if you're new. Because what I'm about to tell you changes the way that flash of red is going to look to you from now on. Most people carry a quiet assumption about the birds in their yard. They assume the birds are interchangeable, that the cardinal at the feeder today is probably not the same cardinal as last week or last year, that birds come and go, that they are abundant and replaceable, that the yard sees a constant rotation of individuals passing through on their separate ways. This assumption is wrong, and the science that corrects it is more affecting than most people expect. Wild birds live far longer than most people realize. Not all of them. Some species have short lifespans shaped by predation and harsh conditions, but many of the most common birds at American feeders are built to last in ways that most of us have never been told. The northern cardinal, the bird that appears in more American backyards than almost any other, has a documented wild lifespan of up to 15 years, with the oldest recorded individual reaching 28 years and 3 months. That number is worth sitting with. 28 years. A cardinal that hatched the year your youngest child was born could still be visiting your feeder today. The black-capped chickadee, so small it seems almost fragile, regularly lives 8 to 12 years in the wild, with documented records beyond that. Research from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology has tracked individual chickadees across more than a decade of winter seasons at the same feeding stations, confirming that the small bird you see on a January morning at your feeder may have been visiting that same feeder since a president ago. The American robin, which most people think of as a seasonal visitor, has been documented at 12 years in the wild. The house finch, 11 years. The mourning dove, a bird that most people barely notice as it walks beneath the feeder collecting fallen seed, over 10 years in the wild, with captive records approaching 30. The house sparrow, 13 years. The white-breasted nuthatch, 9 years. The tufted titmouse, 13 years. These are not the lifespans of creatures that pass through your yard and vanish. These are the lifespans of creatures that could have been present in your yard, at your specific feeder, through an entire decade of your life, through graduations and retirements and grandchildren, and the slow accumulation of ordinary mornings. Through all of it, the same bird at the same feeder, the same shape in the same tree. And once a bird establishes a territory, once it has mapped the landscape, identified the food sources, learned the patterns of the humans nearby, it does not leave without reason. Territorial fidelity in songbirds is one of the most consistently documented phenomena in avian research. Studies tracking banded individuals across multiple years show that the same birds return to the same territories, the same trees, the same bushes, the same feeders, season after season with extraordinary precision. A chickadee that chooses your yard does not choose it casually. It makes that choice based on a careful assessment of resources, safety, and the human activity patterns it has observed. And having made that choice, it tends to keep it. What this means in practice is something most feeder owners have never stopped to calculate. If you have been putting out seed for 5 years, the chickadee you see today may have been watching that feeder since the first week you hung it. If you have been in your home for 10 years and the cardinals were already there when you moved in, you may be seeing the same pair that was there before you arrived. The relationship between you and that bird did not begin recently. It began years ago, and it has been developing ever since on both sides in ways neither of you fully understood. Take a moment with that. The bird that comes every morning, that appears at the feeder before you've opened the back door, that lands on the same post in the same spot, that has a particular way of tilting its head when it hears the sound of your door, may have been doing exactly this for years, may have watched you through multiple winters, may have adjusted its schedule around yours over a span of time that represents more of your life together than you realized you were having. If this is the kind of thing that shifts how you look at your yard, subscribe to Backyard Bird Mind and share this with someone who keeps a feeder.
The birds they think they know, they may know them better than they realize.
Here is where the science gets more specific and more personal. Bird banding studies, long-term research programs in which individual birds are marked with uniquely coded leg bands and tracked over time, have produced decades of data on how specific birds relate to specific places. The results are consistent across species and geography. Birds with established territories return to those territories with a fidelity that borders on the absolute. In one long-running study of black-capped chickadees in the northeastern United States, researchers found that more than 80% of birds that survived the winter returned to the exact same territory the following spring, often within a few meters of where they had been the year before. A few meters. The same tree, the same branch, the same feeder. These are not birds who found a yard that worked and are vaguely attached to the general area. These are birds who have mapped a specific piece of the world down to the scale of a human backyard and return to it with the precision of someone coming home. The territory is not a habit. It is a location they know, a resource they have invested in, and a set of relationships, including the one with the human who fills the feeder, that they have spent years building. The cardinal you see at your feeder in January is very likely the same cardinal that was there last January and the January before that. The chickadee that takes the left perch is probably the same individual that chose that perch the first time, because that individual already knows that perch is safe, already knows the distance from which the human inside the house will approach, already knows the sound of the door and what comes after it.
There is no learning curve for a territory you have already lived in for 3 years. There is only the return to what is known. You can sometimes recognize individual birds without even trying. The cardinal with the asymmetric crest, the chickadee that is slightly more tolerant of approach than the others, the house finch that always arrives from the left and always leaves to the right. These details, which most people register without naming, are the signatures of specific individuals you have been watching for years. They were always there, visible to anyone and looked, quietly identifying themselves to a person who didn't yet know they were meeting someone rather than watching something. If you start paying attention to the small distinguishing details, a slightly bent tail feather on the mourning dove, a faded patch on the house finch's crown, the particular way one cardinal always approaches the feeder from the north, while another always approaches from the east, you begin to see what was always there. Your yard is not populated by birds, it is populated by specific birds, named in a sense by their own consistent individuality, each one carrying a history that overlaps with yours in ways you are only now beginning to understand. Researchers who study individual bird recognition have found that experienced birdwatchers can identify individual birds by behavioral signature alone before they even see the bird's markings, the way it lands, the specific arc of its approach, the angle it holds its body when it eats. These are not learned performances. They are the individual personality of a creature that has been doing this in this yard for years. What you register as that cardinal is actually a specific behavioral profile built up across seasons of observation, yours and theirs simultaneously. This is not a casual observation. It changes what is happening in your yard from an exchange between a person and birds into something closer to a relationship between specific individuals. Individuals who have shared a space, learned each other's patterns, and developed something that functions, at a biological level, as familiarity. The bird you see is not a representative of its species. It is an individual. It has a history. Part of that history is you. Consider what this means across a span of time that most feeder owners have experienced without naming it. Think of the first winter you put out seed. The birds that found it in those first few days were not random passers-by. They were the local residents, the territory holders, the birds who had already claimed that airspace and were evaluating the new resource you had introduced. The chickadee that arrived on day 3 and came back on day 4 and day 5 was not a different chickadee each time. It was the same one, running an assessment, deciding whether you were reliable. If it stayed, it stayed. It is probably still there. That cardinal who appears in exactly the same spot at exactly the same time, who tilts its head the same way, who does not flush when you move slowly, but does when you move fast, that bird has years of data on you. It was building that file while you were simply living your life, simply looking out the window. and thinking how beautiful the bird was, not yet knowing that the bird already knew who you were. The relationship in your yard is older than you thought.
The bird you have been calling the cardinal or that chickadee is not a category. It is a someone. And that someone has been coming back to you season after season for longer than most people would guess, for reasons that include, among the food sources and safe perches and learned signals, you. This changes the nature of what you are doing when you fill the feeder. You are not simply providing food for birds. You are maintaining a relationship with specific individuals who have chosen to include your yard, and by extension, you, as part of the landscape of their lives. That is not a small thing. In the life of a creature that has been watching the same space for a decade, returning to the same branch through the same winters, the person who fills the feeder consistently is not anonymous. You are part of how that bird knows the world. How long have you had a feeder? And have you ever noticed the same individual coming back year after year? Tell me in the comments what you've seen. Subscribe to Backyard Bird Mind if this changed how you see the birds in your yard. And share this with someone who has been watching for years without knowing who they were watching.